This week, I'm really excited to be joined by our partners at the National Association of Elementary School Principals, also known as NAESP, and Gracie Branch, who will be telling you a bit more about NAESP in just a moment. Gracie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to represent the National Association of Elementary School Principals in this collaborative effort with CASEL. Working together, we know that we can provide administrators the critical resources that they need to be successful during this extremely challenging time. At NAESP, we're committed to meeting principals where they are and helping them to get where they want and need to be. A huge thank you to CASEL for your partnership in this endeavor. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Gracie. So as Gracie said, we know that school leaders have a lot to consider when planning for the summer and the fall. And I would like to invite two members of my team to join us to discuss reopening and renewing school communities with SEL. Melissa Schlinger is CASEL's Vice President of Practice, and our Director of Field Learning, Justina Schlund, will be joining us now.
Thanks, Karen. And I'm really excited to be on the CASEL CARES webinar this week talking about this important topic. For those of you that are new to CASEL, I want to take just a few minutes to just do some background information. As you may know, CASEL's been around for 26 years with a mission of helping to make SEL part of every child's education pre-K through 12. We do that with efforts in policy, efforts to advance the research around SEL, and also the practice side to really understand and support what's happening in classrooms, schools, and districts in our country. The way that CASEL defines social and emotional learning, or SEL, we coined this term 26 years ago, and you may be familiar with CASEL's definition that this is really a process both for children and adults so that they can acquire and apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills that they need to understand and manage their emotions, to set and achieve goals, to feel and show empathy, to establish and maintain relationships, and to make responsible decisions. So when we think about social and emotional learning, many of you may be familiar with this graphic that we have up here. This is known as the CASEL wheel. This wheel shows us the 5 competencies in the middle that we think about when we think about social and emotional learning. In orange, you see the competencies related to ourself. So self-awareness being, how do I know and understand myself, my emotions, my cultural identity, my mindsets, and how I really can process who I am and how I feel. Self-management has to do with what we do without that. How do we manage those emotions like stress or anxiety? How do we cope? How do we stay motivated when we're not feeling it? How do we work towards goals and achieve those goals? That's all part of self-management. In green, we talk about how we relate to others. So social awareness has to do with our ability to understand others' emotions, or to take their perspective, to read social cues, to understand social norms. How do we understand those around us? And then relationship skills has to do with how we interact with others around us. So how do we communicate effectively? How do we deal with conflict? How do we ask for help when we need it, or provide help when we sense others need it? These green areas have to do with interacting with others. And then in yellow, responsible decision making has to do with how we put this all together to reflect and analyze problems and situations and put those competencies into practice to really make good decisions. Here we do more problem solving, evaluating of consequences, and reflecting on situations. So these are the competencies that CASEL's referring to when we think about social and emotional learning. And these rings around the wheel are reflecting where these things happen when we think about a systems approach to social and emotional learning. We are promoting the idea that social and emotional learning can be promoted throughout, not just simply with a program or a lesson, but rather lots of ways within the classroom, school, and with families and communities. in classrooms, not only do we promote the idea that you can do explicit instruction, but we also know you can integrate SEL into academic instruction, and that SEL is also promoted by the way in which the classroom is organized and the climate. That's true also of what's happening at a school level. So how is the school managing discipline? How's the school climate? And of course, on that outer ring, how do we interact authentically with families in collaborative ways? And how do we work with community partners? All of these together are what CASEL refers to as a systemic approach to social and emotional learning. So when we think about the importance of social and emotional learning, now more than ever, we've seen people really recognizing just how critical SEL is. When you think about what I mentioned about coping skills, dealing with stress, dealing with anxiety, managing our relationships when we can't physically be together, staying motivated to work hard in school even when you don't have the supports in place that you might normally have. How do our teachers, how do they cope with the stress of switching how they're teaching and continuing to collaborate with their colleagues during this period? Social and emotional learning has never been more important. And what we wanted to do today was talk a little bit about how we can think about school as we prepare to re-enter and reopen schools with social and emotional learning at the center of those plans. Now, when CASEL thinks about a systemic approach, whether we're talking about at a school level, a district level, or even at the state level, we talk about four main areas to think about when thinking through a systemic approach. The first area we like to think about is what are those important foundational planning steps that need to be in place so that we can really make sure we have a strong foundation for the work ahead. The second area has to do with the adults. How are we supporting the social and emotional competence of our adults, giving them what they need to feel supported and giving them opportunities to collaborate and develop relationships with each other, and so that they can not only be taking care of their own well-being, but be good models for our young people. Thirdly, we think about what are the specific things that we need to be doing to promote the social and emotional competence of our students. How do we engage with our students? How do we provide a supportive learning environment for them? And how do we give them opportunities to learn and practice their own social and emotional competencies? And then lastly, the fourth area, how are we paying attention to data to know if what we're doing is having a positive effect? So these four areas are part of CASEL's framework for thinking about this systemically. And today I'm excited to talk with you, with my colleagues. First, Justina Schlund, who's the Director of Field Learning at CASEL. She oversees the development of practical resources for the field based on the insights and experiences and research that come out of our collaborating partners. Before coming to CASEL, Justina actually was the Executive Director of Social and Emotional Learning in Chicago Public Schools. We will also be joined today by two principals. First, we'll have Giovanni Ramos, who is the principal at Foundation Preparatory Charter School in New Orleans. Foundational Prep is a literacy-focused, slow-growth charter school focused on building the intellectual and social and emotional growth of children to become advocates for themselves, their families, and their communities. And we'll also hear from Cesar Rivera, who leads Samuels Elementary in Denver, Colorado. Cesar has served Denver Public Schools for 20 years as a teacher, literacy coordinator, and school leader. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Justina, who's actually going to take those four areas I mentioned one by one, and we're going to be thinking about those areas and how they relate to the current situation that we're in with the COVID crisis. Justina?
Great, thanks so much, Melissa. And as we jump into these four actions, just to note that CASEL released this week an initial guide that overviews all of these actions for school leadership teams. And we're also working really closely with our collaborators right now to produce additional resources that we'll be sharing this summer. So I wanted to jump into the first action that Melissa highlighted, really about foundational support for not just SEL, but for the transition ahead. So we're really thinking about this as how do we take the time right now to build the partnerships that are needed, to deepen our own understanding, and to plan for SEL. So this includes thinking about how do we communicate with our students, our families, and our staff about the importance of SEL as a critical component to this transition and to education as a whole. How are we really learning from our students, families, teachers, staff, and community partners about what their hopes and their needs are as they're looking forward to what school will be like this summer and fall? And how are you examining kind of deeply what you've already done to support SEL? A lot of schools and districts that we've talked about have already done lots and lots of work this summer. They've jumped right into it to thinking about what are the types of relationships that we need to build, what are the distance learning strategies that can promote SEL. So now really, as we move into summer and fall, is a good time to begin taking a look at what's working well, what we may need to improve. And lastly, thinking about how are we going to form this coalition of folks that might be a formalized transition team, it might be representation of groups across community partners and families and students, et cetera, to think about what does our transition plan look like, particularly around how are we developing the social emotional learning supports that both our adults and our students will need. So Giovanni and Cesar, would love to invite you two to chime in now to share a little bit about what are you doing now to create this type of foundational support for SEL, either through your communications, through engaging with your stakeholders, through your planning efforts.
I can go ahead and jump in. We are fortunate enough to be in a partnership with the Ballas Foundation right now, which has been super supportive regarding developing relationships with both CASEL, our after-school care providers, and any other service providers at Samuels. And so that really has helped us create this system around prioritizing social and emotional learning. Part of that prioritization has been adopting an evidence-based curriculum school-wide, and having tremendous buy-in from our staff has been kind of a byproduct of that. We serve a pretty heavily diverse population in our school that's impacted by poverty and by socioeconomic considerations, such that grounding of socio-emotional learning with an evidence-based curriculum has helped to enhance the tool belt that our teachers have. And then as we launched into this remote learning setting in Denver, the emphasis that we put on socio-emotional learning was first and foremost. We wanted to, number one, prioritize connectedness with our children to let them know that we were there for them to support them throughout this remote learning experience, whatever that was going to look like, whether it was, you're in a home with very supportive parents, or on the other end of the spectrum where you might be home completely alone. But we're here to connect you to both the work that we've been doing, which has primarily been academic work, but then also the work that grounds us in our relationships with one another. And so that's one facet that's been really, I think, helpful and supportive. And then having a staffing model where we've been able to connect with students that have been a lot harder to connect with. Our partnership with Jewish Family Services in Denver has been tremendously meaningful, whether it's within the building, having a counselor that's available to broker those needs with students socio-emotionally and their families to provide wraparound support, but then also to be present in the community to satisfy those most basic needs of food. They've been a supplemental provider of food for our families throughout the community. And so this effort has been throughout our school and throughout our community, and with a ton of help from outside entities, including Wallace, CASEL, Jewish Family Services.
I think similarly to Cesar and Samuel, Foundation Prep has been lucky enough to partner with other organizations that have been able to support the launch of our SEL curriculum and the continuation of it in our school. Being a slow growth standalone school, we have very limited resources, but we were able 2 years ago to partner with IWEST, the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies, and in response to the trauma that we know that our students have seen in the city of New Orleans, and the trauma that their parents have seen, the inherent trauma that has taken place in our community here, knew that we needed a really strong SEL program with outside support to help us really implement that and help give us feedback on how to make it better, and really get the insight of professionals on how we can really how we can really make this the strongest and really impact all of our students. So we've been able to do that. So I think that since we had that start the previous year and the start of this year, it was pretty seamless for teachers to still be able to communicate the importance of some of the SEL activities that may have happened at school to them to start to happen at home. So teachers are posting some of their favorite SEL games and SEL activities for students to engage with, and they're not in virtual Zoom sort of meetings where it's like log in and now we'll all do it together. It's more things too of like there's some of those, but then there's also the ones of this is posted on like your Class Dojo account and you can go and access it whenever you may need it. You need this song at this time. Your kindergarten teacher has posted it for you. So we're wanting to make sure we continue to do all of that and still implement all that remotely, knowing that this experience is just another incident that now has just piled on more trauma for our students and for our families. So it's fortunate that we had that start and that we can continue to do this remotely. But again, it wouldn't have been possible without the support. We can take it to a bigger scale with the support of iWest. They hosted and we co-hosted a webinar with families for families in April, not just for our families, but any family that can access or anyone who can access our social media on COVID-19, and focusing on how do we talk to children about COVID-19, what are some signs and what are some things that you might see from your child that can indicate stress and that can indicate trauma, and then also giving them more insight to the SEL posts and the SEL activities and things that are happening virtually. So it's been exciting and going to be really interesting to see what happens when we get back.
Thank you so much, Giovanni and Cesar. And I heard a lot from both of you that you already have a strong foundation in place, which can be really helpful right now, especially. Clearly, you both have been doing quite a bit of communication to your staff, to your families, to your students about the importance of social and emotional learning. And it sounds like you've had great partnerships with others that you've brought into this mix as well, which we know all of those things are really important to establish that strong foundation before thinking about how we are going to reopen. Justina, is there anything you would share for principals maybe that didn't have this strong foundation already in place that we would recommend that they think about as they're preparing to reopen schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a couple things. One, I think, especially for principals, Giovanni and Cesar, I think are excellent examples of principals who've done kind of their own SEL work and learning. So I think school leaders right now have been asking a lot of questions about what is SEL, what's the research base, and the more that you can build up your own learning, I think the more effective you are at working with others to build that foundational support. And then the other thing, I think Giovanni and Cesar really highlighted some of the great ways they worked really deeply with families and community partners, and also with students to kind of set the groundwork for saying what needs to occur so that we're creating this culture of SEL across our school, which I think is a great transition actually to our second key action that's really talking about even before we start kind of jumping into all the supports that we're going to talk about for our students, we wanted to highlight that it's really important at this time, especially, to be thinking about adult SEL. So Emily, if you could pull up the second slide, we'll talk about this action around designing opportunities for adults to connect, heal, and cultivate their own SEL competencies and capacity. I think there's been a lot of research about the stress and anxiety that educators may feel in a normal circumstance, and we know that the pandemic has only added to a lot of their stress and anxieties that not just not just teachers are undergoing, but staff, as they think about how to really feel connected and supported to their work at this time. So as you're thinking about transition back, we really think it's important to carve out deliberate time for staff to discuss their experience about the past few months, reflect on how they can be using their own social emotional competencies to support one another and their students. This is also an opportunity potentially to create some conversations that are future thinking. What have our staff learned? What have the adults in the community learned from this experience? How have the disruptions highlighted strengths in their students and in themselves? How has it highlighted potentially new ways of teaching and engaging students and families? And how has it shined a light on inequities that need to be addressed by our school and the system at large? So I think this is also a good time to begin thinking about how to offer ongoing opportunities for both collaborative planning as well as professional learning that are going to help educators on an ongoing basis support students' SEL. And also, I think we just need to call out that we think it's important that we're on the lookout for whether adults themselves are going to need some additional support, whether it's with mental health or trauma, and how do we help connect them to those additional resources. So I think, would love to just hear a little bit more about what have you all done and what are you all planning to do specifically in supporting adults in connections, in healing, in practicing their own SEL. And maybe this time we'll start with Giovanni.
Yeah, I think something that's just kind of happened, well, like if you think about like when we're in school, we're all working together, we have those moments to make connections and build relationships just by like passing someone in the hallway and just like seeing someone in the office, and you can have those check-ins at those times. And then we have like our formal meetings where we'll sit down, look at student data, where we'll talk about school culture, all those types of things. But now since we're in this virtual space and we don't have those opportunities to just build connections like throughout the day, I think something that has happened is like meeting structure and format, where a meeting that might be titled first grade ELA distant learning planning, that may be the focus of the meeting, but we have to designate some time at the beginning of those meetings and also at the end to even just do a personal check on how you're doing, a personal engine check, and just opening up times for people to just share and just talk about how they are, and just when people want to be open and when people want to make that connection, and letting it happen and working around working around that. I think is one thing, but then we also more deliberately with iWest has been leading, and now they are training or supporting our teacher leaders to lead these groups too. But they started something called BYOT, Bring Your Own Tea, and it's really just a space where we had recruit all staff members, either randomly, not with the people they would normally be working with, so not your grade level team, or also in like groups, so parents in one group, or our teachers that are 23 to 28 in that like age range. Just knowing that those personal experiences may bring different responses and different challenges to what is happening right now, and being able to talk in like maybe a common group would bring out people's, would really help people open up, be vulnerable, and be to the place where others can actually now lean into support. In those sessions, there's a time where there's a quick share, and then there's a time when if a leader, myself and my co-principal, we are in that group, because we also are in them too, that's when we leave, and it gives the space for the staff team members to just talk on their without having that leader present, because that also does make a difference at times in how honest you really want to be. And then it'll end, the leader comes back in, and it ends with some resources that iWest or another organization will provide for us for teachers in their own mental health. So I guess kind of twofold, just natural shifts in the meeting structure and the time that we're together, but then like deliberate times to come together and build the connection.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. As Giovanni was talking, I was writing down some notes. just as far as some of the work that we've been doing with our staff and work that we've been refining around adult SEL. And so one of the things that we launch with regularly in just about every meeting with both adults and children is this protocol of good things that we adopted from Capturing Kids' Hearts. And in good things, you just share something good that's happening in your world. I think what is helpful as far as that goes, and Giovanni was getting at this a little bit too, regarding the getting different folks together, perhaps in different age levels, perhaps with different backgrounds, but it helps to reduce that bias that might be present for whatever reason. And instead of shooting right into content or right into the work of the day, folks are able to connect interpersonally with one another. And then, especially looking at different screen images of people during the day, you might actually come away with, oh, well, I can connect with so-and-so. I wasn't so sure when I jumped on the call if I was going to be able to connect with so-and-so because they didn't look so friendly, but now I see, what they're all about, and I can connect, and then I can engage in the work. And so that's been a really strong practice. I think in moving forward, there is this tremendous need to get back to the community that we all were part of and that we all created in our live setting within our school. And so allotting time for that to happen, whether it's remotely or not, whatever the future is going to bring, is such a critical element of moving forward, to share those successes of this very strange time of remote learning, where children have brought us into their lives, both in the figurative sense as far as connecting over a computer, but then also in the literal sense, like we are in the living rooms, the basements, the bedrooms of our children's lives. And so to bring that to color with one another is so important, because it drives everything that we're about. This whole work of engaging children in meaningful experiences within school. And so to find that commonality with one another and to share those successes, and then also to share those areas where, it wasn't so successful. And we did learn maybe not the greatest about our students' lives, but to still be the supportive adults that we ever were in our school, and to leverage all the systems that we've built. At Samuels, we're super fortunate to have a pretty extensive wellness team that includes a restorative approaches coordinator, who we call our wellness coordinator, a full-time school nurse, a full-time school psychologist, our Jewish Family Services mental health therapist, our counselor, and our assistant principal, myself, some paraprofessionals and members of our student services team. And so together we work to problem solve and communicate with one another the different elements of impact that we've had on a student's life. And it is those groundings of these school teams that are present in our building that both help to support students, but then also help to support the work of our teachers and give them efficacy as far as impact into the lives of our children. And so, it's a couple of things. It's coming together and connecting with one another in the work that we're so passionate about. And then it's also continuing that work in a way where we're getting back to the community that we had before. And so when I look into the fall, those pieces are really important to consider in terms of moving forward all together, and moving forward in a way such that we're supportive of one another's efforts.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think you both touched on some really important efforts around making sure that our adults continue to feel connected to each other by creating space for those personal check-ins to see how they're doing, some opportunity for reflection. I love that you mentioned about pairing folks up and creating those opportunities. We at CASEL are doing that as well. We miss being with each other in the office, and we have CASEL buddies that change every week, that we get these one-on-one connections with folks that we might not otherwise be seeing in a meeting. And I think just being really intentional about that now and carrying that forward, as you said, into the fall to make sure that we're continuing to build that collaborative spirit. One thing we've heard from a lot of our districts is that having to teach in different ways has really encouraged teachers to collaborate with each other closely on how are you using Zoom and what are you using for video, and maybe you and I can do this together. And we're hoping that that collaborative spirit that has resurfaced out of a need to learn something new together will continue into the fall. And we know that when teachers feel connected to each other and where they feel supported and they feel a sense of belonging, the research is clear that it benefits them and it benefits students, and they're less likely to burn out, they're less likely to leave the teaching profession. So there's lots of great benefits to taking care of our adults and offering them support services. We know that adults are also going through a lot right now with the pandemic. They may have lost loved ones, they may be dealing with their own children at home while they're trying to teach their students. So your sensitivity to what adults need is so important, and we are really grateful that you've prioritized that. And we're really hoping that schools, as they think about reopening, there's this we all are feeling the pressure of getting back to instruction because of the potential instructional loss, and we're all very aware of the COVID slide, that there might be an urgency to just get right down to the basics without remembering that we really do need to take care of our adults and their healing, as well as our students' healing as well. So we're grateful that you all have recognized that, and look forward to seeing some of these practices that may be new during this period continue in the fall. Justina?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Yeah, and I think kind of building upon what we're talking about with the adults, now thinking about how we're supporting our students, which we know really rely on the adults in the building, and how we're creating the both emotionally and physically safe environments, right, that are engaging and promote students' social emotional development throughout. So I think part of this includes ensuring that those supportive teacher-student relationships that were either built pre-COVID, that were developed through kind of creative means during COVID, or that need to be redeveloped, are really being prioritized as we're thinking about the fall. And I think there are structural considerations that you may be exploring, such as looking for opportunities in your schedule to minimize the number of transitions so that students spend greater time with individual teachers, potentially creating those community building routines that can be both in person and through distance learning, if distance learning will be continuing in some respect. And then just in any way making sure that every student has at least one caring adult at the school who's regularly checking in with them. Related to this, I think, as we all have kind of touched on here, is the opportunity to weave in social emotional learning practice throughout the school day for students. And I think this is really important to think about a developmental lens right now. So what may be particularly important to students at different developmental stages. For example, we know that young children are really working on emotion regulation, and right now, as they're dealing with a lot of changes, as we're coming back into school, may be a good time to kind of focus on those strategies for how they're understanding and talking about their emotions. For adolescents, who we know have really deep social connections with their peers, this may be a good chance to kind of help them rebuild those social bonds, talk about how to practice relationship building strategies across distance learning. And for older students, I think this can also be an opportunity to really reflect on the impact of the pandemic on themselves and their communities, and really doing some of that kind of inner self-awareness and social awareness work. And then the last couple pieces I think that relate to what we've already talked about here is how to really align the efforts that we're taking with families and community partners. As you all have mentioned, right, we've really kind of broken down some of these school walls because we've had to during this time, and now we're doing SEL in basements and all these other places, right? And so how to work really collaboratively on an ongoing basis to ensure that that continues. And lastly, I think as we talked about with adults, making sure that we're paying attention to what students may be struggling for personal reasons, because of they've experienced some kind of trauma, because they're feeling very stressed, whatever the case may be, recognizing that our students are coming to us from potentially very, very different experiences at this time. So Giovanni and Cesar, I would love to hear you guys talk a little bit more and expand upon how you're planning to continue promoting students SEL this summer and into the fall. And maybe Cesar, starting with you, I know you had talked about an evidence-based program that's been successful at your school. Wondering if you are going to be building off of those strategies or other strategies to really weave in SEL throughout the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So our evidence-based curriculum is second step, and I think what it does is it affords strategies for kids to utilize, whether it's anything from calming down to solving conflict with their friends, most likely now their siblings, perhaps their parents. And then it's also a means for parents to exercise those same strategies or to reinforce those strategies both in the summer and when we return in the fall, whether it's live or remote. I think what's important for certainly my school, I think across our nation, is that we do have this tremendous shift, and it's a shift towards socio-emotional learning and providing for and supporting our children's emotional needs, and away from, I think, the academic rigor that we've engaged our children in on the daily, and that has added such pressure to our lives. And it's hard to get away from that, right? Because we all are working towards increasing academic outcomes. We're all working towards reinforcing a love of learning with our kids. We're all working towards, or within this paradigm that we're currently living. But during this time of crisis and coming out of this time of crisis, we are going to need to more than ever attend to the socio-emotional needs of our children. And so the shift is so necessary. I reference this book all the time. It's a great resource that we read together as a staff. And the title, go figure, All Learning is Social and Emotional, Helping Students Develop Essential Skills for the Classroom and Beyond, by Nancy Frey, Douglas Fisher, and Dominic Smith. But this was such a grounding of both practice and theory that our staff wrapped their brains around. And we just need to do it some more, because there's one thing that I think will continue to undermine our efforts with children, and it will be that insistence on that grade level rigor. It will be the insistence on attacking a gap that our kids have. It will be the insistence on, well, I need to have this child have this, meet this expectation, because if they don't meet this expectation, that will reflect poorly on both me as an educator and us as a school. We need to move away from that. And so to move towards meeting those socio-emotional needs, to move towards ensuring that our children feel safe, to move towards ensuring that our children have a sense of belonging and authentic connectedness, both to their teacher and to the content that their teacher is trying to teach, is going to be critical as we move forward. There are so many different ways in which our lives are now at a tilt, and we need to reestablish in the most basic ways the connections that we are building with children. Just the other day, you know, I'm a parent as well. I have a third grader and a fifth grader. And just the other day, I was walking, you know, past my third grader, and he was on a Google Meet with his teacher, and his teacher was doing a read aloud. And to listen to her voice at that time, and to know that that was the connectedness, that was the belonging that my child was experiencing, was in its most simplistic way the deepest connection that I think happened on that particular day. And we can't take those things for granted. We really can't. And I think we have for too long, and we need to get back to that connection of child and teacher in a very meaningful way, much more meaningful than you know, test prep or the rigor of the grade level standard or meeting XYZ goal.
Cesar, I love that you spoke about like the connection and the love between teachers and students, and then also students needing to come back to a safe space, in the space where they do feel belonging. I think kind of a lot about that too for the adults as well. This is like a time when it's interesting because like we're all experiencing at some level the same experience that's causing trauma, however it's happening. But this is like where a teacher can feel, yep, I may be from this part of the country and this age, but at this time in 2020, I went through this, and so did my 6-year-old. So did the 6-year-old in my class as well, and we all did this, and we all lived through that experience of where we were in school on March 13th, and then all of a sudden it was taken away. And when school is a safe place is your safe space, either for a child or for an adult, like going to work, going to that classroom, like that's something consistent that makes them feel safe, helps them feel that sense of belonging. It was just like ripped away very abruptly. And going back into the space and going back into school, how do we know that it's not going to happen again? Or how do we go through the daily day-to-day without the anxiety and the fear that it is going to happen again? And knowing that that abrupt parting of ways was really tough for kids and students, for teachers and students. So one thing that we're working on for restructuring is that we're looping a lot of teachers to the next grade with their students. So if you are a paraprofessional on that grade level, you're moving up, and then we have at least like one teacher to go up to the next grade level, just to provide that consistency. So we're addressing not only the academic needs, as in like, you know where these students are, you know where you left on March 13th, but also we've had a relationship already. You trust me. Let's like start this already where we have this trust, because there's going to be a whole lot more coming already. Things are going to be really challenging, and we know that kids aren't going to learn from people they don't trust and have that connection with. So we're making a concerted effort to do that. And then also just like continuing the stuff that we're doing now, and knowing that it's definitely still going to be needed, also mainly really on the adult end, like those BYOT meetings, making sure we still have those, making sure we're still things that we implemented now out of crisis for adults that we continue to do for them in case we are in this space again. They are equipped to go into this experience a little stronger than before. Doing so stuff like that, and then also knowing when we come back to school, start having a pretty much I think of it like a reorientation. And like if you had like I think of some schools, at least down in New Orleans, or some of our charter schools, where it's an orientation week and you learn about the school values and the mission and like those things. Really having like more of an orientation week around SEL and what our SEL program is, what SEL is, and then like and getting it to the point of where and having all staff be involved and getting into smaller groups where rather than 4 adults for a grade level, it's 7 adults for a grade level, and reducing the numbers there, and having that be something that happens every day for like a period of 2 weeks, just to really build that up. Again, wanting us all to be stronger and more aware of our emotions in case we have to go into this experience again. It's just something to think about for the comeback in.
Yeah, thank you. And I think You both touched on some really important aspects of building those strong relationships between teachers and students. And especially when we think about going into the fall, it's great if you're able to practice something like looping, where the kids don't need to learn and get to know a new teacher. In some schools, they may not be able to do that. So some students may be just getting to know their teacher for the first time, potentially in a virtual environment. So being really intentional about how do you develop a new relationship virtually is definitely going to be a challenge. And we know that while it's not ideal, for kids to have those kinds of experiences, like you mentioned, the story being read, both in the larger group of the class, also in some smaller groups, and also some one-on-one opportunities to connect directly with that teacher is so important to develop those strong relationships. And also keeping in mind that they need to build those strong relationships with each other, because they may be in a new class, they may not even really know who else is in there. So to try to facilitate some of those relationship building across, so that the kids can feel that sense of belonging. So just like we would in a normal classroom where we're together, if we're virtual, trying to create opportunities for partners or small groups to interact is important to build those relationships. And I think your comments, these are about the academics. We know that when students have strong social and emotional competencies and a supportive learning environment and a sense of belonging, that those things actually enhance their academic engagement and performance. So sometimes people think that they are doing SEL at the expense of academics. And what we know from the research is that when you're focusing on SEL, you are in fact enriching the academic experience as well. So doing these things together are really important. And if we take a different approach, like you mentioned, test prep, where you're really focusing on learn this material as opposed to the relationship, that is not effective. So glad you brought those important strategies up, and also your use of an evidence-based program. I know a lot of the program providers out there have free resources right now that students and families can access now, that can help them think about how they can be continuing to practice and build their social and emotional competence at home. So that's another great strategy that I'm glad was mentioned. I know we're running short on time, but we do have our fourth area that we want to talk about. So Justine, I'll turn it over to you to talk about that.
Great, thanks. And I think as we're talking about whether it's academics or social emotional learning, this fourth area becomes critically important, which is really how do we use data as an opportunity to both deepen our relationships as well as continuously improve our support for students, families, and staff. So, we're not just doing SEL as kind of a nice to have or a feel good, but because this is grounded in science and because we're able to connect this to outcomes at our school. So I think this involves, one, are we collecting regular feedback from all members of our school community, and also considering not just how do we get their feedback, but how do we share the feedback back, and engage our staff and our students and our families in the problem solving around how can school better support their academic and social and emotional needs. We think, at this time, even though there's a lot on your mind, thinking ahead to what are the types of data that's going to help you continuously examine and improve your SEL efforts, which may be in the form of existing school climate assessments or social emotional competence assessments. It may also take the form of really supporting teachers in thinking about how these new instructional practices that they're being asked to take on, how they're kind of in a very low stakes way reflecting upon these practices and continuously improving. And then lastly, I think, as you all have talked about, I think it's also very important to pay close attention to the data on who's attending and engaged in school, who may be struggling and needing additional support, and for these students, really developing a plan that addresses root causes and doubling down on that outreach and relationship building. So Giovanni and Cesar, just wanted to, in the last couple minutes, talk about a couple of the ways you're thinking about ensuring that you're responsive to the data and continuously improving how you support your staff and your students during this time. Giovanni, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think I can start thinking I've had some answers and it just raises more questions for me, but we will continue to we'll continue to administer our SDQ, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which we administer 3 times a year, beginning, middle, and end of the year. I'm interested now to see how we collect the way we used the data in the past before was to look at the impact scores, and then based off of impact scores, then decide or look at students that may need to be grouped, put into like a small group SEL, and maybe it's not a whole class, or maybe they just have some additional counseling minutes with one of our social workers. That's how we've used the data in the past. And on the SDQ data, it's teacher, parent, and then in the upper grade, students can rate themselves. It's going to be interesting to see what that data looks like now as adults and parents specifically have been spending more time with their children, and teachers are going to be spending less. So I'm wondering what the data is going to look like when the teachers do when teachers do score students and when parents do score students, if those look a little different now. It's going to be really interesting, but we will still administer it, and whatever data we do get, again, also wanting to use it to just determine who might need more additional supports as soon as we get into school beyond the tier 1 level. I think that's just one thing to say there.
We've also administered SEL Web as part of our work with the Wallace Foundation that gives us more kind of global information as far as those different CASEL competencies and how students are interacting with one another. And I think to go with that sense of belonging, that's been something that we've been working on in the last few years. We have a really diverse population of students. We've got over 40 languages represented at our school, kids coming from every socioeconomic level, but primarily very impacted. Right around 80% of our kids qualify for free and reduced price lunch, and the majority of our students live in apartment living, which, you know, there's something to be said about being so close to so many people and living in such a densely populated area that it's almost sometimes nonstop as far as how kids are engaged. And so utilizing all of that data to build better experiences that kids can have with one another, whether it's out on the playground, and we see an opportunity to utilize some of the strategies that kids might have learned during second step, or it's within the classroom, and children are utilizing those same strategies. And perhaps another strategy, school-wide, we created mindful corners, kind of stole something from a Nashville school called Peace Corners, but utilize that in order for kids to manage themselves and to calm themselves down and to have that mindful moment where then they can go back and re-engage with kids that might manage their emotions differently in whatever way. And so, you know, taking all of that data that we've received, whether it's SEL Web or Best Screener, or Denver Public Schools has a whole child survey, and we have those results on a yearly basis, or the student satisfaction survey, or even doing, and I think this is probably the most powerful, even executing a classroom survey on, let's say, a Google form as far as how things are going with remote learning to best inform, you know, what are next steps together as students and teachers, maybe even rolling that out to parents, since parents are playing such a tremendous role in the education of their children right now, and identifying areas that we can change to be more effective, areas that have been working well that we want to continue, and maybe some areas that we just have to get rid of for the betterment of the experience of kids.
Great. Thank you both so much. And I hope that this period will give us a chance to reflect on what we've been doing, like you just said, and see how we can continuously improve. I know we are out of time. We're so grateful that you all joined us. We know how busy you are, and there were so many really important messages that were surfaced today. We really hope that those that were listening have been thinking about how they can also lay a strong foundation in place, engage their community partners, and also make sure that they are, secondly, supporting those adults in their own social emotional needs, thinking about the students themselves and promoting their SEL, and then using that data for continuous improvement. So thanks again to both of you, and I will turn it back over to Emily to close us out.